This is the number of seconds in an average human life. You understand what seconds are and you understand human lives, but you probably have a hard time comprehending this number. It's just too big. Despite the fact that it's about your life, there's nothing in your life that you can relate it to. Here's another big number. If you don't recognize it, let me spruce it up. This is the US national debt. Now, despite the fact that this number was too large to understand, and this number is 15,000 times bigger, everyone seems to have an opinion about this number. We're going to cut this number down to size and peek under the hood to try and understand what's actually going on. Here's a graph of the US national debt going back to 1981 when it was about 1 trillion. Today in 2023, it's about 32 trillion, and these are the three major events that got us there. Funding the global war on terror that came out of 9/11, the 2008 global financial crisis, and the money we spent during the COVID pandemic. Now, before we go into why this graph is so deceiving, I want to give you some data to possibly dispel what I think is the biggest myth around the debt, which is who's to blame. Even though the budget is determined by Congress, the presidents are almost always vilified about the debt. Here are the various presidential terms. The four presidents that contributed the most to the debt, Bush Jr., Obama, Trump, and Biden, all had at least 2 years where they controlled both the House and the Senate. If either party had wanted to do something serious about the debt, they could have. Let's look at the specific numbers. Here it's broken out by each individual president and added up by party at the top. 16 trillion for the Republicans in red and 15.5 trillion for the Democrats in blue. Those aren't very convincing numbers. We could pick them apart a bit. After all, the Republicans had more years in office than the Democrats. The per year in office numbers are a little bit different. We also said that the majority of the debt was accrued during three events that date back to 9/11. If we only count that debt, it's still only 13 to 14 trillion. Still not very convincing. I'm not going to try and tell you to stop hating one party or the other, but I don't see any convincing evidence that one party is to blame for the debt over the other. All right, let's get back to that deceiving graph of national debt. In the beginning, we talked about large numbers and how they're hard to understand if you can't relate them to something that you understand. In order to do that for the national debt, we're going to use a concept that you probably already know. If you've ever gotten a mortgage or asked for a car loan, then the bank most likely looked at your debt to income ratio. It's a relatively simple concept of adding up how much debt you already have and comparing that to your current income. If you have too much debt, the fraction gets larger, that's bad. If you have a nice healthy income, the fraction gets smaller, that's good. Economists use a similar concept to look at national debt. It's called debt to GDP, where GDP is the gross domestic product of a country, which is a measure of the size of its economy. The size of a country's economy is related to how much tax revenue they can generate. Over the last 40 years, the US economy has grown dramatically. So if you start to look at debt as it's related to GDP, you get this graph. Now, it hasn't changed that much. It's still scary. It honestly still looks a lot like the debt graph. But that's because we haven't changed the scale on it. If you normalize the data, which is just a fancy way of putting them both on the same scale, you get this. You see US debt on the top going up 32 times, what we've already talked about over those 40 years. But now you see debt to GDP has only gone up 4 times over that same amount of time. When you compare debt to GDP, it's like inflation adjusting the numbers. We all know that in 1981, money then is not worth what it's worth now. We have to inflation adjust it. That's kind of what we're doing when we compare the amount of debt that the country has to how big the economy of the country is, which has dramatically changed over the last 40 years. We're going to have to go one step further in order to really understand what's going on with the US debt. But first, let's see how we compare to other countries in their debt to GDP ratio. Here we are on a list of countries ranked by debt to GDP. This is not a contest we want to be winning. But you can also see where other developed nations are on the list. We're above many of them, but not by any extreme measure. More importantly, most of these countries don't have a special trick up their sleeves, a trick that's going to lead us to the next step in understanding the national debt. And just like debt to income ratio, it's something you already understand. Most people understand that the interest rate of a loan will dramatically affect how much that loan costs. National debt is typically interest only, which means that they really have no plan to pay off the principal of the loan. Now, that's a conversation for a whole nother video that will also surprise you. But for now, all we really need to understand is that a loan at 4% is twice as expensive as a loan at 2%. The trick that the US has up its sleeve is that when it goes to the bank, it is the bank. It sets its own interest rates. It's not that simple, but when the economy is as large and dominant as the US economy is, it tends to dictate the interest rate environment all around the world. Other countries are not so lucky. So let's look at what interest rates have done over the last 40 years. This is a graph of the 10-year Treasury rate. The US debt is more complicated than one Treasury, but it's a pretty good indicator. You can see that interest rates have come down substantially since 1981. I've labeled rates at 3 different times, and let's overlay them on the debt to GDP graph. You can see that even though debt to GDP has risen, the interest rate on that debt has dropped. But we don't need to beat around the bush. The exact cost of the US national debt is public information, so let's just plot that. This graph is what the US government paid on its debt for the last 40 years. However, let's remember the first deception. In order to understand large numbers, we need to relate them to something. And once again, we're going to relate it to GDP. Because what we really want to know is how has the cost of our debt changed relative to the size of our economy? We're going to inflation adjust it again. That produces this graph, which is the cost of US debt per GDP, which is finally what really matters when you're talking about the US debt. This graph is pretty surprising. It probably contradicts a lot of the things you thought you knew about the US debt. In fact, it's so surprising you might be wondering, where did all this information come from and can you trust it? Well, the information all came from the Federal Reserve Economic Database, otherwise known as FRED. It's maintained by the St. Louis Federal Reserve, and it's all public information. In fact, the vast majority of the graphs in this video are just snips from the actual FRED website. Now, this graph isn't. So why did I change the most important graph? Well, here's the FRED version, and you can tell me what you think. You can see this one, although it's the exact same shape, looks a lot more extreme. That's because the FRED website has a nasty habit of not starting their y-axis on 0, which makes changes in graphs look more extreme than they are. You look at my version, where the y-axis starts on 0, it's the same shape, but it doesn't look as dramatic because there's more white space at the bottom. I think this is a better representation about what we want to talk about. Now, you may still not believe any of these graphs. So I'm actually going to give you a couple of data points that you should be able to quickly verify with a couple of Google searches. The first point is for 2015. In order to get US GDP, you can just Google US GDP in the year and you'll find out it was 18.1 trillion. If you want to get the interest that the government paid on its debt, you'll probably have to look that up in FRED. I didn't find too many other reliable sources for it, but it was 428 billion. You do the math and that's 2.3%. Here's another point in 1995, GDP 7.6 trillion. Debt interest, 352 billion. Do the math, about 4.6. You can reproduce this entire graph through this process. All right, let's recap how we got to this graph. In the beginning, we learned that just because the debt went from 1 trillion to 32 trillion, it doesn't tell the whole story. We need to compare the debt to the size of our economy, which was relating it to GDP. And we looked at debt to GDP, we found out that over that 40 years, it had only gone up 4 times, not 32 times. This is kind of like inflation adjusting the numbers. Then we looked at interest rates and saw that over the last 40 years, interest rates have come down dramatically from 8% in the 80s to 2.5% or less recently. This has caused the actual cost of the debt to come down dramatically. It provides this graph, which seems to imply that it hasn't really changed much over the last 20 years, except this little bit at the end, which we're going to come back to. Not only has it not changed much, it's actually come down from about 30 years ago. So is it not a problem? No, it is. Trust me, there's plenty to still lose sleep over. It's just not the problem everyone makes it out to be. It's 32 trillion. They have no ability to pay it off. Both of those things are true. It is a very big number. And the US government, like most governments in the world, have no intention of paying off their national debt. So, what's the problem? You promised me that there was something that I could lose sleep about. There is, and it comes down to that little tail at the end. If you've been around my channel before, then you may recognize this little tail. In fact, the last 20 years of this graph look a lot like this graph, the Fed funds rate. If you remember back, we talked about the special trick that the government had up its sleeve in that it could set its own interest rates. Well, this is that interest rate, the Fed funds rate. And you can see that the recent rises in the cost of our debt are directly related to when the Fed has raised interest rates in the near past. In fact, this tail is directly correlated to the record-setting interest rate hikes that we've been through in the last 6 to 8 months. But the Fed's stated goal is that they're going to get interest rates back below 2%. So this should come back down. So what's the problem? That kind of is the problem. The problem with our debt is not that it's grown so large that the cost is spiraling out of control and we have no hopes of paying for it in the future. In fact, the cost of our debt really hasn't changed much over the last 20 years. The problem is that we've operated at such incredibly low interest rates for so long that we've backed ourselves into a corner that if we raise interest rates, we dramatically impact the cost of our debt. That's a problem because interest rates are the primary tool that the Fed uses to influence the economy. If it's concerned about inflation, it turns them up. If it's worried about a recession, it turns them down. But if it's already near zero and a recession comes, you can't turn them down anymore. It's a matter of flexibility. Similarly, in the future, if for some reason we need to operate at a 3 to 5% Fed funds rate for several years, it will dramatically impact the cost of our debt. The problem is fixable, and the solution is not to reduce the debt. We simply need to ensure that future revenue outpaces the cost of the debt, and that is achievable through reasonable cuts in spending and increases to revenue, which probably means a little bit more taxes for everybody. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking it. If you'd like to see similar content, please subscribe to the channel, and you can check out this video about inflation. Otherwise, thank you. I'll talk to you soon.